Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. It started on a Tuesday morning and I almost missed it because I was looking at the road. I was driving my work truck down Aldwell Street toward the first job of the day, a blocked inlet on the north side of the commercial district, and it was raining the way it had been raining since Sunday, steadily and without much enthusiasm. The kind of grey October rain that doesn't commit to being a real storm and doesn't commit to stopping either. I had the wipers going and the defroster running, and I was thinking about the inlet blockage and whether it was going to be a dig job or a jet job, and somewhere in the peripheral vision of my left window, I noticed that the rain was going the wrong way. I pulled over. I got out of the truck and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the rain on the left side of Aldwell Street, which was falling upward, rising from the pavement in thin streams, moving upward in the same rhythm and roughly the same volume as the rain coming down on the right side of the street and on my truck and on me. It wasn't violent or dramatic. It was just rain, doing what rain does, except in the wrong direction, as calm and consistent, as if this were the direction it had always gone. I stood there getting rained on from above and watched the rain on the other side of the street rise into the clouds, and after a minute, I got back in my truck because I had an inlet blockage to deal with, and standing in the rain wasn't going to answer any of the questions I had. My name is Garth Well, and I've worked storm drain and utility maintenance for the city for 9 years. The job involves a lot of things that people don't think about until they go wrong. The network of underground culverts and inlets and outlets that manage where water goes when it rains, the pump stations that move it through the system, the connections between the storm drain infrastructure and the natural drainage of the landscape. I spend a lot of my working life underground or half underground, in the concrete channels and access shafts that run under the city's streets, keeping the water moving in the right direction being generally down. By the time I got to the commercial district, the upward rain was the subject of about a dozen phone calls from my supervisor, 2 from the city engineer's office, and a steadily increasing number of citizen complaints that our dispatch was trying to categorize under existing service request types and failing. I pulled up the complaint map on my tablet and saw the affected area laid out, a rough oval covering about 30 blocks on the low side of town. The areas that sat below the natural grade of the surrounding streets. The flat bowl of land that collected water in heavy rains, and that the city's storm drain system had been specifically designed to manage. The lowest ground in the city. The places that would flood first if the system failed. I drove the perimeter of the affected area before I did anything else, because I needed to see the shape of it before I could think about what to do with it. The upward rain had a clean edge, not gradual, a specific line where the downward rain on one side became the upward rain on the other. On one block it was raining down, and on the next block it was raining up, and the boundary between the two was about as wide as a street. The storm drain inlets in the upward rain zone were backing up. This made immediate physical sense, because the inlets were designed to accept water coming down off the pavement and channel it down into the underground system. and the water was coming up off the pavement instead, which the inlets had no mechanism for handling. The water was moving backward through the drain infrastructure, instead of collecting in the low areas and draining outward through the system. It was being pulled from the underground pipes and rising. I called my supervisor and told him what I was seeing. He asked me what I recommended. I told him I didn't know yet, but that we should probably get the pump stations on the north and east sides of the affected area shut down before they started running in reverse and damaged themselves, because a pump motor running backward is a pump motor on the way to being an expensive problem. He authorized the shutdowns, and I spent the first 2 hours of the morning coordinating that while the rain kept falling up inside the oval and down outside it, steady and unremarkable in both directions, as if the sky had simply decided to run 2 separate weather systems simultaneously and didn't see why that should be anyone's problem. I started looking at the geography of the affected area more carefully around midday. I had a city topographic map on my tablet, and I was looking at it in relation to the upward rain boundary, trying to understand why the boundary was where it was, why it followed the specific contour it followed rather than some other boundary. The affected area wasn't perfectly correlated with the lowest ground, but it was close, biased slightly to the south and west of the lowest point. The lowest point of the affected area was a depression on the south side of a park called Weller Green, a natural bowl in the landscape where the land dipped about 8 feet below the surrounding grade. The city had put a major retention basin there 20 years ago to manage the water that collected in the heavy rain events. A concrete-lined basin about half an acre in size. The retention basin was, theoretically, accepting water from the upward rain, except the water was rising out of it instead of filling it, the basin's surface showing a slow upward movement rather than the expected inflow. I found a historical flood survey in the city's engineering database from about 15 years ago, a comprehensive assessment of flood risk that included historical flood records going back to the city's founding. I read through the historical records while I ate lunch in my truck, looking for anything about the Weller Green area specifically. The survey mentioned a proposed large-scale development project from the early 90s that had included flood modeling for the entire low basin area. Modeling that had concluded the area was at significant risk from a major storm event. The development hadn't happened, which the survey noted was fortunate given the flood risk assessment. It included a projection of what a 100-year storm event would have looked like in the area, which was substantial. The projection showed the Weller Green Depression and the surrounding 30 blocks under several feet of water. I put the survey down and looked out the windshield at the upward rain moving through the park, and I thought about what 30 blocks underwater for an extended period would do to the physics of water in that place. And I thought about what was on the other side of the rain falling up, and I ate the rest of my lunch without tasting much of it. I found him at the retention basin at Weller Green at 4 in the afternoon. He was sitting on the concrete edge of the basin with his feet not quite touching the surface of the water below, which was still moving slowly upward in the way water moved in the affected area, a gentle, persistent rise. He was wet through in the way a person gets wet through when they've been outside in the rain for a long time and have stopped trying to do anything about it. He was looking at the dry streets, visible beyond the boundary of the upward rain zone, with the specific quality of attention of someone who has seen something they don't have a framework for yet. I parked the truck at the edge of the park and walked over, and he watched me come without making any move toward or away. He was maybe 50, lean, with the weathered quality of a man who'd spent decades working outside. His clothes were practical and worn, the kind of layered working clothes that were designed for wet conditions, and they had the look of gear that had been wet so many times the fabric had permanently taken on a slightly darkened quality at the seams and cuffs. I sat on the edge of the retention basin a few feet from him, and we looked at the water moving slowly upward between us. He said, without looking at me, "It goes down here." I said it did, normally. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "All of it? All the ground is dry." I told him we'd had a wet October, but the ground was holding and the drainage was working. I said there was a drought concern in summer, but nothing serious. I said the land was functional, which was a strange thing to say, but seemed like the relevant information. He looked around at the park, at the grass and the trees and the dry sidewalk at the boundary of the upward rain, with an expression I recognized from people who had been through something large and were recalibrating. His name was Fen Darby. He told me that without being asked, which suggested he'd been thinking about the conversation we were about to have and had decided to start with the basic information. He'd grown up in a world where this part of the city had been underwater since he was 19 years old. Not the whole city, the low areas, the bowl that the flood survey in my database had mapped as high risk, the 30 blocks that correlated almost exactly with the boundary of the upward rain. A storm event when he was 19. The kind of storm that the city's infrastructure hadn't been built to handle, had filled the low basin, and the water had never fully receded. The storm drain system, overwhelmed, had failed in the specific way that things fail when they were designed for a load and are given something larger, and the water had found its level in the low areas and stayed there. 30 years of adaptation. The city had built around it, rerouted streets, elevated what could be elevated, abandoned what couldn't. The people who'd lived in the low areas had moved out or been moved out, and the basin had become a permanent feature of the landscape. The low bowl of the city permanently several feet deep in standing water that turned over slowly and smelled of silt and long stillness. He'd worked water management his whole career, same as me, but from the other direction, managing the infrastructure around the permanent flood rather than draining water away. He knew the low basin the way I knew the storm drain system, from the inside, with the specific expertise of someone who had spent decades working the problem. He'd come through the thin place at the bottom of the Weller Green Depression because 30 years of water pressure on a boundary that had been wearing down had finally pushed him through. He said it without drama, matter-of-factly, the way you describe a thing that happened that you didn't choose and can't undo. I asked him what it had been like coming through into dry land. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the grass in the park, at the ordinary October grass of a park that had never been flooded, and he said it had been the most disorienting thing he'd experienced in 50 years of a life that had not been short on disorienting things. He said the sky looked wrong to him, without water in it. I asked him about the water moving out of this world, about the wells dropping and the retention basin draining upward and the underground system running in reverse. He understood immediately what I was describing and said, yes, the physics of the boundary pulled water from the dry side toward the submerged side, the same pressure differential that had pushed him through, but working on water rather than on a person. I asked him if he needed to go back, or if going back was something he wanted. He considered that for a long time, which I respected. He said he'd been trying to decide since he'd come through. He said dry land, genuinely dry land, was something he hadn't stood on since he was 19 years old, and that the sensation of it was almost too much to process, like a color he'd forgotten existed and was now seeing again for the first time in decades. He said a part of him that he wasn't proud of wanted to stay here on the dry ground and not go back to the work of managing a flood that was never going to end. Then he said, but his life was there. His tools and his knowledge and the specific problem he'd been working his whole career, the water that needed managing, the infrastructure that needed someone who knew it. He said a world with a problem in it was still a world, and walking away from the problem didn't solve it. I told him I understood that. He said he thought I might. We sat on the edge of the retention basin for a while as the afternoon light went grey and the upward rain continued its steady rise around us. And then he stood up and looked at the water and looked at the dry ground beyond the boundary and looked at me. He said, "Will it close when I go back?" I told him I thought it would. I told him I thought the boundary had worn thin from his side and that once the pressure was relieved, the thin place would thicken again, the way a worn section of pipe stops leaking once you relieve the pressure upstream. He nodded. He said that made sense, that the physics of it was more like plumbing than anything else. I said that was roughly how I'd been thinking about it too. He stepped off the edge of the retention basin into the water, which shouldn't have been possible because the water level was several feet below the rim. But he stepped into it the way you step off a curb, one foot and then the other, and the water accepted him without drama, and he went down into it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 30 years working in permanent floodwater, unhurried, not struggling. Then he was gone, and the water surface was still, and then it began, very slowly, to rise in the normal direction, filling upward from below the way a retention basin was supposed to fill. The upward rain stopped within 2 hours. It stopped the way weather stops, gradually and without announcement, the upward streams thinning and then ending, the boundary dissolving, the rain across the whole affected area returning to the single direction of downward rain falling on a city that had drainage infrastructure ready to handle it. The pump stations came back online. The inlets cleared. The underground system ran the right way through the pipes, and the water went where water was supposed to go, which was away. I spent the next 3 days doing infrastructure assessment across the affected area, checking every inlet and outlet and pump station and access shaft for damage from the reversal. Most of it was fine. The pump station motors that had been shut down in time were clean. A few inlets had sediment issues from the upward flow that would need jetting, but nothing structural. The wells in the affected area came back up within 48 hours, the water table recovering the way water tables recover when the thing drawing them down has stopped drawing. I filed the maintenance reports and categorized the event under extreme weather event, secondary infrastructure effects. which was the closest existing category, and left it at that. The last thing was the drain on the south edge of Weller Green Park, the one closest to the retention basin, the one that had been at the center of the affected area for 3 days. I checked it on the 4th morning as part of the post-event inspection, crouching down with my flashlight to look into the inlet and assess the interior condition. The inlet was clean, no sediment, no structural damage, everything as it should be. Except the water at the bottom of the shaft was moving very slightly upward, not dramatically, not enough to cause any functional problem, not enough that anyone who wasn't looking for it would notice. Just a slight upward pull on the surface, a barely perceptible movement against the natural direction, like the last trace of a current that had mostly stopped. I held my flashlight steady and watched it for a minute. Then I marked the drain for monthly monitoring on my work order, noted the slight anomaly, and moved on to the next inlet on my list. The park was ordinary around me, wet grass and bare October trees, and the grey sky doing the ordinary thing of holding its rain for now and letting the ground dry out at its own pace. The retention basin was at the correct level, full from the storm but draining normally, the water moving through the outlet pipe at the expected rate and going where it was supposed to go. Somewhere below that basin, 30 years of permanent floodwater sat in a low bowl of a city that had learned to live with what the water had taken and hadn't gotten back. I drove to the next job and let the drain do what drains do, which was manage the water and keep moving.